Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. As you longtime listeners know, sometimes that PhD in Spanish literature comes in more handy than other times. And today, as we dive into Pedro Pàramo by Juan Rulfo, it will come into maximum handiness. Quick note to interject here that if the audio isn't quite what it usually is, I apologize for that. Microphone difficulties here at the Fox Page HQ. So we always begin these lectures with this question of why read this book. I have loved Pedro Pàramo for a long time, ever since I read it in graduate school. And I've thought about doing it a few times for these lectures, but was really spurred into action by a review that I read of the new translation. So this review was by Valeria Luiselli, whose Lost Children Archive is just an unbelievably great piece of literature. We absolutely must take a long look at that book. But when Luiselli was weighing in on this new translation, and really I think was putting her stamp of approval on it, I realized that this is the perfect moment to go back to the book. I'm also laughing a little bit because I think that was like last year. I think I read the thing, maybe in the fall, but maybe in the spring, but honestly, it could have been 2024. I was spurred then, but not quite enough. Now I've finally been spurred, and now we are actually doing the lecture. So this is one of those foundational texts. It's so important to the entire body of literature in Spanish, and certainly in terms of Mexican history, that it's one of these things where I'm really concerned about doing the book justice. As we tackle some titles, I feel a little bit more pressure than others. Part of that is because this is a very challenging text in many ways, but also it's just because it's so incredibly important and it is so good that I want to be sure to cover all of the very important things to say about it, and also hopefully add a little something new to the conversation. The thing I think I'm going to add, which is new, is that a lot of people think of Pedro Pàramo as an example of magic realism. We are going to talk at the very end about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his use, the influence of Pedro Pàramo on 100 Years of Solitude. We're not going to talk about that until the end, because I really actually don't want to link Garcia Marquez together with Juan Rulfo too early, because I really want Juan Rulfo to stand on his own. I want him to be the focus of our conversation. What I'm going to argue is that, yes, in many ways, this is a precursor to magic realism. But for me, the most salient aspect about the text is that it is a modernist text. And don't worry, we're not going to get like really in the weeds with this whole idea of classifying literature. But when you think of modernism, you just think of these texts like Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, or James Joyce. Later, we have Faulkner in the United States. These are texts that are fragmented. They're trying to do something new. They're often in response to a very difficult time. In England, it was after the First World War. In the case of Rulfo, in large part, it is a response to the Mexican Revolution. So I am going to argue throughout the lecture today that a lot of the aspects of this book, the things that make it challenging and also very rewarding, are very much in the vein of modernism. It's a book that I do not think has gotten its due in English. That is in part due to the fact that it is a challenging text. If you're someone who has read Pedro Pàramo, if you love this book, then you should really feel good about yourself as a reader, because it is not an easy text to handle. We're going to talk at the end about why I think 100 Years of Solitude is actually much easier to approach. Look, here I was saying that I wasn't going to talk about Garcia Marquez until the end, but now we're kind of dipping in. But that is a book that I will argue is actually much easier to read because it is a little more in the realist tradition. Whereas this modernist text that we have with Pedro Pàramo is very fragmented. It's dealing with the interior thoughts and feelings of people, not their actions. It is playing with time. It's playing with all sorts of different narrators, different voices. It's like reading Virginia Woolf in Spanish, which to me is just like the most incredible, most fun thing to do, but it is that kind of challenge. So this is a book that was published in 1955. Again, it's hugely important in terms of the canon, the body of Mexican literature. And it has sold 1 million copies in English, but as you might imagine, I think it deserves many more. For those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to get up to today. We're going to talk a little bit in the beginning about the difficulty of the text, what makes it so challenging, also, of course, so rewarding. We're going to do a very, very brief bio of Juan Rulfo. We're going to talk then about the idea of this modernist text as being kind of a bridge between modernism and magic realism. At that point, we'll talk a bit about why 100 Years of Solitude, I think, is the easier text to approach. We're then going to dive in a little closer to this addition to the text. We're going to talk about the prose itself, a little bit about the narrator. Then we're going to talk about the translation. We're going to take a step back and just like figure out for a second what is actually happening in this book, what is going on, which is not the most important thing about the book. But I think for many people, it's very satisfying and very grounding to take a step back and think like, what is it? What is the mechanics of what is happening in Comala? We're then going to talk about Comala and all of the people in this book as these kind of mythological archetypal figures and spend a little bit of time on why the book feels so timeless and why it feels like something that could be applied to many, many different cultures. But then in the end, how it feels distinctly Mexican. We're going to talk about a bunch of the textual things. We're just going to touch on all these amazing things that he is doing without diving too deeply into them. But I think as I kind of list them off, you'll recognize a lot of these different aspects from your own reading. We're then going to talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a couple of the actual things that he literally like lifted from Pedro Pàramo. In many ways, they should be read as kind of a tribute, as like a little bit of a revelation to the reader that he, in fact, is very deeply affected by this novel, and that there really, like literally could not have been 100 Years of Solitude without Pedro Páramo. And then we're going to talk about the close of this very slim novella. This is a good place to let you know, are there spoilers? I mean, kind of, insofar as this book has spoilers. I mean, I guess the answer to that is yes, there are going to be spoilers. I will let you know before we dive into those things that I'm about to spoil something, so that if you haven't read the book yet, you can fast forward a bit. But I do think, I mean, it's a very slim little novella. It might be best for you to just take a minute here and trust me that this is an insanely great novella, and that you should take the afternoon to read it and then come back. But I also think that this lecture might actually be very helpful in terms of understanding what is going on. Very famously, Juan Rulfo said that this is a book that needs to be read 3 times in order to be understood, which honestly, there is nothing more modernist. The modernist aesthetic, this idea of these modernist pieces of literature, so we're talking from 1910 roughly until 1960, part of what makes them modernist works is that they're really challenging the form of the novel. It is a text that does not read like other novels. And in some ways, it's very purposefully difficult. I mean, he's not doing this just to frustrate the reader. In fact, he's doing it to engage the reader. But more importantly, he's doing it in order to express a reality that has everything to do with revolution and injustice and corruption and death and love, really very large themes that I imagine Rulfo doesn't think that he could tackle in the normal form of the novel. And that is where we end up with Pedro Pàramo. So we're going to do just like a very ultra quick bio here of Juan Rulfo. He was born in Sayula, which is a little town in Jalisco. Sayula is a town that is referred to often throughout Pedro Pàramo. So we have this sense, and Comala in the book is actually kind of a mythic town. It does not exist. Apparently there is another Comala in Mexico, and a lot of people like make a pilgrimage there, but that is in fact not the pueblo that Juan Rulfo is thinking about. His Comala is a totally made up version of many towns in Mexico. He was born in 1917, which is really important. So the Mexican Revolution begins in 1910. You have the Cristero uprising in like 1926 to 29. So he would have been at the beginning of that conflict, he would have been about 9 years old. One of the interviews that I listened to talked about the fact that his father was killed in these revolutions. He, in fact, was a huérfano. He was orphaned when he was young. He went to live for a while with his grandmother, and then I think was at an orphanage, which was like very militaristic, and I think really shaped a lot of his life and actually a bunch of his writing. He wanted to go to a certain university, but it was on strike. It was not available for him, so he went elsewhere. He was a tire salesman, and that is one of those times when he was able to but he was traveling all over Mexico into these small towns while he was selling tires. He then later became an editor for this was so interesting to me. It was like an arm of the Mexican government, and it was like a publishing arm. And what he was publishing and what he was sort of overseeing was like the official version of the native peoples. So it would be like in history textbooks, there would be stuff about the native peoples, and he was kind of editing that. He died in 1986, I believe, in Mexico City. He was also an incredible photographer. I think he had some issues with alcohol. I did not dive deep into other aspects of his biography, but it is very important to realize that the Mexican Revolution was essentially happening along with his childhood, and that he was deeply affected by all of this. Okay, we are going to kick things off by talking about the difficulty of this text, why it is that Pedro Páramo feels challenging. I mentioned this briefly, the fact that this is a very fragmented novel. You can even see it the way that it is formatted on the page. We have paragraphs of text, and then we have white space, and then more paragraphs. You can tell because we have italics, we have all sorts of different symbols that are signaling dialogue. We have M dash, we have double quotation marks, we have single quotation marks, we have guillemets, which are those little like arrow things that they use in France. All of that is to speak to the fact that Rulfo is doing something unusual. This is not just sort of your normal novel. The text is very polyphonic, so that simply means that it has many voices. A lot of times people think that Juan Preciado, who is our narrator at the very beginning, who speaks in a first-person narration, a lot of people call him the narrator. And I think in the beginning, you can believe he is the narrator. And I'm not going to spoil anything yet, but I can tell you we do have Juan narrating his experience in the first person. But right from the beginning, we have all of these other voices that are entering in the text. So it's polyphonic in the sense that we're hearing all of these different voices. And in some ways, that is so revolutionary. I mean, you really, if you compare this to like Virginia Woolf, where we have this narrator that is entering into the minds of all of these different characters, and we're seeing their thoughts and we're seeing them quoted. But Rulfo, in some ways, is taking that even further because we're hearing long chunks of the voices of these people, what they are saying, what they are, also, of course, what they're feeling. But the idea of hearing all of those voices quoted verbatim is extraordinary. Along with this polyphonic notion comes the idea of dialect. So we have a bunch of dialect here, and in fact, a lot of it is sort of archaic. We talked a minute ago about how Juan Rulfo spent a lot of time traveling through many of these small towns throughout Mexico, and was really, I mean, he, as an author, was someone who was very attuned to language. And so he incorporated a lot of these different voices, and in doing so, also a lot of different dialects. I'm going to just like bust out with something really sort of difficult here, which is something very important in my opinion. Some of this language harkens all the way back to sort of colonial Spanish, harkens all the way back to the Spanish colonial era. There's this very interesting linguistic thing that for the most part, language evolves from the center. So if we are going to consider Madrid the center of the Spanish-speaking world, language will evolve, it will change in Madrid, and then it will move outward. This is all before social media and all of this globalization. I mean, who knows what's happening now? Actually, linguists probably know. I do not know. My linguistic training, which still holds and held for many centuries, is that language does change from the center. So what's fascinating is that you could find, not too long ago, at least in the middle of the 20th century, in Mexico, Central and South America, you could find these pockets of language that was like 16th century Spanish, because it simply wasn't evolving at that time. Of course, you have to think about the pressure of the indigenous languages, which is really important. But Juan Rulfo's use of some of this archaic language is speaking to something very important, which is the Spanish colonial era. So if you imagine all of the native peoples of Mexico, Central America, and South America as being invaded by these Catholic Spanish conquistadores, you can think then of all of the violence that was wrought on this country, or this series of countries, by the Spanish colonialist forces. What's interesting, of course, is that Spanish then becomes the dominant language. I mean, that's not that interesting. That's just like how colonialism works. But it's interesting to me to think about the ways that most people who are living in Mexico, Central and South America have ancestors who are both, at some point, indigenous peoples and also colonial people, which in many ways makes things very complicated. But one of the things that Rulfo is pointing to with his use of this archaic Spanish is that colonial era. So he's evoking in some ways the violence of colonialism, and he's setting that in very subtle ways, largely through this use of archaic language here and there. He's setting that against the background of the Mexican Revolution. So we have the present violence of the 20th century, of the Mexican Revolution, but it's kind of layered on top of this idea. I mean, the book is written in Spanish, that in itself should be speaking about the idea of colonialism. So we have a text that's fragmented, one that's polyphonic, one that has a lot of dialect. It's also totally nonlinear. So he plays a lot with time. We move backward and forward in time, just like constantly in a way that is very unmooring for the reader. There's also a lot of figurative language. It's such beautiful prose. It's just, I mean, we could open to any page and spend hours dissecting just the absolute beauty of the language that he uses. But I will be the first to say that it's not necessarily all clear what we are talking about. But there's a huge amount of figurative language, metaphor, symbolism, simile. The birds are really symbolic, the trees, the rain. I mean, all of these different things stand for what they are, but they also stand in for other forces. We also, another aspect that makes the book difficult is this idea of kind of the mythic quality. In many ways, it's sort of timeless. It has this sort of epic feel to it. And it's not until we reach, sort of three-quarters of the way through, and then at the very end of the novel, that's when it becomes kind of more grounded in time. We have mention of the Guerra Cristera, the Cristero uprising, and then at the end we have a mention of Villa and Carranza. So we know then that we are firmly in the 20th century. The Mexican Revolution, I believe, 1911. I'm always so happy to hear. I mean, I've listened to many different lectures and read lots and lots of stuff about this book over time. And at first I was like, okay, I'm going to really have to like study up and understand the Mexican Revolution, and did attempt to do that, and was very happy when I realized that even scholars of the Mexican Revolution are at times confused by the Mexican Revolution. So we have the confusion of the Mexican Revolution at the end, but up until then, we have this very sort of mythic quality. And in some ways, I think that does make it feel sort of difficult for the reader because we're not grounded in the way we would be in your sort of typical novel, which is to say, your typical realist novel. So, those are kind of aspects of the text that make the text challenging and, as I said, rewarding. But I will also argue that there's an extra layer of difficulty if you are someone who is American and who is reading this in English. The reason why I think it's difficult in part is simply the conception of death in Mexico. So, the Spaniards come in, they're a Catholic country. Mexico is very Catholic in many ways. But if you are someone who knows about like the altars that people build or Dia de los Muertos, you know that there is this sense in Mexico that even when people die, they are still, somewhat accessible to us. There is the feeling that if people die violently, that they can't rest and they will kind of come back to haunt you. But more so than that, there is this feeling that we can still be in touch with these people, and that on these altars you leave little things for them, things that they like, foods that they like, because in fact they are still in many ways with us. And there's so many like really appealing ideas about that. And Rulfo is really leaning into that idea. So we have all of these different voices, many of whom are people who are speaking to us beyond the grave. But it's important to note, if you are an American reader of this, that is not, it's not like some Edgar Allan Poe thing where we are being haunted by, I mean, I guess it kind of is like that, but in the ways that Americans look at death, Edgar Allan Poe is writing horror. It's a thing of horror if you have someone haunting you. As far as I can speak to Mexican culture, which is not very far, but through literature and through my exposure as a Californian, and as someone who spent quite a bit of time in Mexico with her grandparents when she was young, I can say that it is not a horror thing. This is not a horror film. This is simply a different conception of what happens when people die. So, this is very important in the text because a lot of what feels kind of normal and accepted about these voices of the dead is very much a part of the culture. It's not something that should be thought of as like magic realism, because in fact, this is largely the way that death is conceived of. So before we move off the idea of like what makes the text difficult, I want to share this amazing insight that was given to me by a very close friend in graduate school. And in fact, it was this book that we were talking about at the time. So I was kind of trying to piece together the whole thing and trying to understand this and trying to understand that. And this very smart graduate school friend was like, maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is not that we should be sort of trying to piece together a chronology, and we should like figure out the plot, and we should figure out who the narrator is and who he's talking to at any given moment. The contention of this graduate school friend, and I absolutely think it's true, is that kind of confusion, like when you're reading something and you're confused and you're like, wait, I don't know which generation we're talking about. I don't know who Don Lucas is compared to Don Pedro, compared to Don Miguel. If you have those three generations kind of mixed in your head and you're not really sure who they are, then you should take a little step back and think like, why is it that an author would want me to feel confused about this? And the answer is very clear, which is that in those three generations, we have this repetition of really important key aspects of those people, which is corruption and violence and horrible attitudes toward women and greed. So all of these things are repeated generation to generation. So essentially, when he's making us confused about which is the grandfather and which is the grandson, that is much less relevant than the idea that nothing is changing, that these people are interchangeable. I'm going to have to bring up Garcia Marquez again. In 100 Years of Solitude, this is the classic example of this kind of confusion, which is that, everyone is named like Aureliano or everyone is Jose Arcadio. There's so many different people. And man, people have done some really elaborate family trees to try to kind of comprehend what is happening with these generations. When in fact, that's not really the point. The point is that if there are 14 Aurelianos, you're not supposed to be keeping track of like who's who. You're supposed to be thinking about the fact that this one generation is proliferating this same sort of person. So this is an excellent tip for all you readers out there, you readers of difficult texts, because basically you can let yourself off the hook. You can be like, wait, I'm super confused about the time here. You just take a step back and think like, why am I being confused about the time? Which is very pertinent here. The reason why you're confused about which time we are in Pedro Páramo, you don't know if we're with Juan Preciado or we're with his mother when she's a child, maybe even if we're with Pedro Páramo when he is a child, which, then you're going back to the late 19th century, 1870 or 80. If we don't know what era we are in, if we can't figure out the year, you just take a step back and you think, okay, that is because not enough is changing. That is because in many ways, it is the same reality for Juan Preciado as it is for Pedro Páramo. So in some ways, I don't think he sat back and was like, okay, let me think of all the ways I can confuse these people in ways that are significant. My sense is that, when he went to write about the Mexican Revolution and the state of Mexico in the middle of the 20th century, to him, it felt like no time had passed, and it felt like everything was fragmented, and it felt like he was hearing many, many voices of many generations. So in this text, we do in fact have this question of like which of the Páramos is which. So we have that confusion. We do have this idea of time as being very elastic. We also, of course, have this polyphony, all of these different voices that we are hearing all in the same plane. They're kind of happening all in the same instance in many ways. We also have all those murmurs and all those echoes and all the shadows, all of which are kind of confusing. But again, you need to think that this is a place that in many ways is haunted, and it is haunted because of the violence of Pedro Páramo, because of corruption, because of revolution. So when you're a little bit confused by like, why are there no trees? Like, it seems weird that there are no trees in this town, especially because Dolores, who is Juan's mother, had talked about it as being this kind of paradise. Then now there are no trees. That's kind of an extreme, and in some ways it feels deliberate, and you're like, wait, what? But when you're doing that, when you're asking yourself like, wait, I can't figure out like why Juan Preciado is having such a different experience, that kind of confusion should help you step back and think a little bit more about what the confusion is trying to do. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about the challenges of the text, we're going to move on to talk about this edition. So the Spanish edition that I have has a cover that I love. Those of you on the YouTube can see I'm showing you the cover here. There are two dogs, kind of wild, savage dogs running along on a cream background with a typeface that I really am enjoying. And it simply says Pedro Páramo and Juan Rulfo. This latest edition that came out in 2024, I'm actually checking, no, it was 2023. So this idea that Valeria Luiselli had really spurred me on, that literally could have been at the very end of 2023. One of the things that I love so much about this cover is that the photograph on the front of it is taken by Rulfo himself. He was an incredible photographer. This was somewhere in Oaxaca, and I just think it's excellent. I mean, you have to look at the back and look at the photo credit in order to know that, but it's excellent. So, of course, the importance of this is that this is a new translation by a guy named Douglas Weatherford. I have to say, part of me was like, okay, if his name is Douglas, then he's going to be very old school. He's going to be, first of all, like an old dude. I don't actually know how old he is, but I was a little bit worried that we were going to have kind of an old and stuffy translation, which some of you were like, wait, how could you have an old and stuffy translation? It's simply going to be what it's going to be. But of course, any novel in anyone's hands is going to be translated differently. And we're going to discuss the translation in 1 minute. But I think the first thing you notice is not actually the Douglas Weatherford thing at the bottom, but the fact that underneath Juan Rulfo, we have in fairly large letters, again, if you're on the YouTube, you're seeing it in front of you there, it says Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So I understand that reason for putting that on the cover of the book. I mean, that's a very good marketing thing in the sense that people are drawn by that name. People want to hear what he has to say. But the bummer is that this is the same foreword that he wrote in 1980. And it drove me crazy when I read it earlier because it is all about Garcia Marquez. I really wanted to hear something about Juan Rulfo. And there's even one point when Garcia Marquez says, for that reason, it would be impossible for me to write about him without it seeming that I'm writing about myself. And in the margin, I'm like, yeah, because really the whole thing is about him. So he tells the story about how he's in Mexico City, he's having writer's block, he really needs to be writing, and that someone tosses him a slim book, and it is Pedro Pàramo, and before you know it, Garcia Marquez can like do the whole entire novel by heart. Like he can simply sit down and recite the whole entire thing with no errors, which I mean, I have my doubts about that. But what is important is that he's really acknowledging the influence that Rulfo has on his work. So I do appreciate that. But I also think, my God, since 1980, don't we have some really important, incredible people saying incredible things about Pedro Páramo? I was a little bit disappointed to have yet more of this same introduction by Garcia Marquez. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm kind of shitting on Garcia Marquez here, and I really don't mean to be. I love his work. In fact, we have Foxed Page lectures on 100 Years of Solitude. In fact, that is literally the thing that has been most downloaded. 65,000 people have listened to that episode, many of them in Colombia, which made me very happy. But I also really feel like in many ways, I want Rulfo to step out of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's shadow. So this translator has Douglas, our friend Douglas, has his note at the back as well. And I always love to hear what translators have to say about their work. And I thought it was so funny because basically what he makes a big deal of is that he has reincorporated all the ways that Juan Rulfo originally was marking dialogue. So again, M dash, and the M dash is typical in terms of Spanish writing, writing in the Spanish language, and in terms of French writing. So lots of times instead of quotation marks, you'll simply have an M dash, and then you'll have whatever the person is saying. I personally really like that very much, but he also has all of these other ways that I talked about before: double quotation marks, single quotation marks, the little guillemets, the little like double arrow things that they use in France. And it's very important. And Douglas talks about this. I don't know why I'm so chummy with him. I should probably be saying Weatherford. Weatherford talks about the fact that for the reader, it's actually much easier because when you have italics, which is another way that we know that someone is speaking, almost always when it is italics, it is Juan Preciado's mother who is speaking. And a lot of those different quotation marks, not actual quotation marks, but marks around quotation, a lot of those signal different people speaking. So in many ways, in the past translations into English, where they have made everything standard with just the standard quotation marks, it's actually more difficult for the reader because you've lost some of this context that you get with all of these different marks of quotation. It's also very well known. There was an English translation. I don't even have the guy's name. It came out in 1959, so 4 years after Rulfo published Pedro Páramo in Spanish. And in that one, apparently the guy, like, because things were really confusing, he just was chopping out whole sections. One of the interviews I listened to said that you can find those editions, but they cost like $2,500, which is ironic because I think they're probably really bad. It was really bugging me that I didn't know the name of that translator. His name is Lysander Kemp, which actually that's kind of an amazing name, Lysander Kemp. But then in the mid 90s, I think it's 1994, we have a woman named Margaret Sayers Peden, and she does her translation, which I think was superior to Lysander Kemp's. But what she did was in her attempts to make things more clear to people, which, I mean, there's your problem right there. Like, you shouldn't be trying to make things more clear. But she took that upon herself and added a bunch of stuff. So Valeria Luiselli speaks to these different sort of translations, one of them being too stripped down, one of them being a bit overdone. And she comes down with the idea that the Weatherford translation is the best of them. It was actually very clever. It's the end of her review. And she says, if Rulfo says that you need to be reading this book 3 times to understand it, then apparently maybe we also need 3 different translations in order to be able to understand it. Leave it to Luiselli to be incredibly clever. Okay, we're going to take a quick second and we're going to take a look at this ultra famous first line of Pedro Páramo. We're going to read it in Spanish and then read both of the translations. I do not have the Lysander Kemp version because apparently it cost $2,500 and it's trash, but we're going to look at the other two. So part of this is just an exercise in translation to realize that the subtleties in a work like this really need to be conveyed, and it just speaks to the difficulty of the job. So this is something I hadn't realized. Apparently in Mexico, you read Pedro Páramo, or at least some of the short stories of Juan Rulfo. It's part of the canon, so you read it in this kind of compulsory way. And apparently the first sentence is something that like many Mexicans have sort of memorized. So we have this ultra famous first line that reads this: Vine a Comala porque me dijeron que acá vivía mi padre, un tal Pedro Páramo. And in the Margaret Sayers Peden, we have this: I came to Comala because I had been told that my father, a man named Pedro Páramo, lived there. So you can hear it's a little bit clunky. My eyeballs are like looking all around the screen if you're on the YouTube. So it's a little clunky because what she does is she interjects a phrase, a man named Pedro Páramo, and then she adds the phrase lived there at the end. She also does this interesting thing. She says she had been told, and in Spanish, it's the preterite. It says el pretérito, me dijeron, they told me, or I was told. It was not I had been told. So she puts it into the pluscuamperfecto, which makes it into, it's like the past of the past. So in some ways, yes, she can think that he had been told this before he left, before he came to Comala, but it's actually not, in my opinion, it's not as faithful to the text. And then in the text, when it has un tal Pedro Páramo, she says a man named Pedro Páramo, and then we end with this idea of that he had lived there. In Weatherford, we have a couple of very important changes that I really liked. So our friend Douglas has the following: I came to Comala because I was told my father lived here, a man named Pedro Páramo. So some really important differences here. One is that we have the preterite, the simple past here. I was told, not I had been told. So that feels to me much more faithful to dijeron. I was told my father lived here. So acá in Spanish, I most certainly think of it as here, but Sayers Peden has it as lived there. So what this is doing right from the beginning, and this is the kind of subtlety that I think the book really deserves, it's putting us right into the place of Comala. So when Sayers Peden says, I came to Comala because my father lived there, it is there. So we have this idea of distance between the reader and the place, whereas with the Douglas Weatherford, it's much closer to this acá vivía. I was told my father lived here. So we have this sense of being much more anchored in the place. And then it's very important to me that Weatherford ends the sentence the same way that Rulfo does. He says, a man named Pedro Páramo. It's crucial. I mean, we've talked a lot on the Foxed page about paying attention to what words come last. You should pay very careful attention to the last sentence in a paragraph, the last paragraph in a chapter, and even the last word of a sentence. So we have all of this momentum of this first sentence, which is crucial, and we end with this very important Pedro Páramo. I think it is very much to Weatherford's credit that he is restoring that. And one of the things that I was kind of bummed out about, there isn't really a way, or at least these two haven't found it, to capture that idea of un tal Pedro Páramo. It's kind of like this guy Pedro Páramo. I mean, that is my like English speaking kind of very loose translation, but un tal Pedro Páramo, it's like, it's very sort of casual, and it's like, it's sort of, to me, it feels kind of like this guy Pedro Páramo. I think this guy, Pedro Páramo, might have been a little bit informal for Mr. Weatherford, but a man named Pedro Páramo is fairly different to my ear than un tal Pedro Páramo. All of this is to say that those of you who are lucky enough to be able to read Pedro Páramo in Spanish, you should count yourselves very fortunate. I have to say, if you are someone who has quite a bit of Spanish or not a ton of Spanish, I'm not sure that I think you should dive right into the original Spanish with this one. There are a lot of books that I would recommend that you read to kind of like, get the Spanish back up and rolling. This is maybe not one of them. You might consider Como Agua para Chocolate. There's a lecture on that, and that is a book that is much more straightforward in many different ways. Okay, so I told you that one of the things that's I think very satisfying, and it totally flies in the face of what I said earlier about just like accepting the confusing nature of this book, which is to just sort of like take a step back and look at what is happening, to try to kind of recreate what it is that is happening. And in many ways, we have a fairly simple plot, which I am going to outline here. And what's interesting is the ways that Juan Rulfo has really complicated the whole thing. So in the very beginning, we have Juan Preciado, who has come into town. By the way, you should hang on until the end of this lecture because I'm going to do a thing at the end about the names. The names in this book are incredible. When an author names a character with his own name, if Juan Rulfo is naming Juan Preciado that name, then you should, maybe just take a step back and think like, okay, this is someone who Rulfo maybe identifies with, this idea of someone who is searching for answers about his Mexican past. And I mean, again, like the idea of him as a huérfano, as an orphan, really speaks to this idea maybe of also wanting to find his father. So we have the idea of Juan Preciado, his mother dies, and her dying wish is that he go back to Comala and get what they owe him. So we find out a little bit later that Pedro Pàramo, who is Juan Preciado's father, he married the mother, Dolores, in a kind of a land grab. And it's interesting to me that she somehow escapes. I mean, she is someone who leaves the town and in fact leaves with one of his sons. So as Juan is walking in, he's walking toward Comala, he runs into this guy who is like a mule driver, and this guy's name is Abundio Martinez. So here we are starting with some spoilers, people. This is, in fact, these are like the big ones. So maybe like zip forward, maybe like 2 minutes or something in the lecture if you're not wanting to hear these spoilers. You're actually going to want to skip ahead 11 minutes. I kept track of it. It took me 11 minutes to kind of run through what's actually happening in the text. If you're someone who doesn't want the spoilers, just catapult yourself 11 minutes into the future of this lecture. So at the beginning of the book, we have this Abundio Martinez, which of course means abundance. He starts walking with Juan and telling him that in fact Pedro Pàramo is dead, but Abundio is very important because we find out at the very end of the book that he is another son of Pedro Pàramo, and in fact that Abundio is the person who is going to murder his father. We don't know that in the beginning. Juan keeps moving. He gets to Comala. He meets a woman named Eduviges. He goes into her house. He hears all of these different echoes, all of these murmurs. He has some, different conversations with Eduviges. Then he dies, which, I mean, spoiler, I think it's about 80 pages in. It's like, sort of 3/4 of the way through the book, 2/3. Which is so important because we have this first person narrator who ends up kind of, he's suffocating. We get the sense that he is being buried alive in some ways. And then in his coffin with him, he also has this woman, Dorotea. So he is hearing all of these voices now in the graveyard. So this is when the polyphony really gets rolling. We have all of these different voices. And through all of these voices, which we've heard bits and pieces of them beforehand, but we start piecing together this story. So we have Juan, who is like our outsider who is coming in, and he is sort of our conduit. He's the way that we are making our way into the town and beginning to appreciate the story of Pedro Pàramo. So the title of the book is very important, obviously. You should always pay attention to the title. And the title of this book in particular is really shaping our focus. We are really meant to focus on this guy, Pedro Pàramo. We learn that his father, Lucas Pàramo, which is very confusing in the beginning, because first we hear about Miguel, who's the son, and then we hear about Lucas, who's the father. Lucas Pàramo is killed at a wedding by mistake, and then Pedro is like sort of ascends and is like the big leader of the Media Luna. And what he starts doing is very corruptly, all these land grabs. He becomes the cacique, the like strong man, the landholder. And he's just taking all of this land from all of these different people. He's raping a lot of people. He has all of these different sons that he does not recognize as legitimate. He has one son, Miguel, who he does recognize as legitimate, and Miguel is a total ass. He is like a crazy rapist. You see the ways that this corruption and violence increases in each generation. Miguel actually dies, which is important. He is not the only son of Pedro Pàramo, but in many ways, because he has the last name, this is kind of the end of the line, which actually has quite a bit to do with 100 Years of Solitude, which really has a lot to do with this notion of the end of a certain line, the estirpe. So right from the start, intermixed with the idea of Juan's story, we hear a little bit about the backstory of Pedro Pàramo, and we find out that when he was a young lad, he fell in love with Susana San Juan. And what's interesting is throughout the entire book, Susana San Juan is resisting Pedro Pàramo. She marries someone else, Florencio, and after he dies, I should know this, but I'm not totally sure whether or not he was killed by Pedro Pàramo. It makes sense that he would have been. Don't quote me on that. But he does take her afterward. Pedro Pàramo takes Susana after Florencio had died. And even after that, she resists. So she resists him in the sense that she's insane. She goes mad. So in many ways, she is someone who does resist him very, very effectively, which is in stark contrast to all of the women he has raped along the way. Toward the end of the book, we have mention of the Cristero uprising. That comes at about page 80. So we are well into the book before we have this historical marker that situates us in time and in space. And then at the very end, as I mentioned, we have Villa and Carranza who enter. They themselves don't. But all of the people who are essentially working for Pedro Páramo join the revolution. A little further along at the very end of the book, also, Susana dies, and Pedro Páramo is so angry because the town has kind of a celebration, but is not, in fact, mourning her appropriately. And in the final pages of the book, we have Pedro Páramo like crossing his arms and cursing the town and saying they will starve to death. And that is exactly what happens. It's also crazy because he is essentially, I mean, the town is his. He essentially owns all of the land and he owns everything that's happening. So when he is doing this, when he curses the town in this very kind of petty and spiteful way, he's actually also harming himself. So if we look at him as like as an example of the Mexican landholder of this era, we see them as corrupt, we see them as greedy, we see them also as doing all sorts of things that are really contrary to their best interests. Then at the very end of the book, we have Pedro Páramo killed by Abundio, which that in many ways just crushed me because Abundio's wife has just died, his cuca, he calls her, that's the nickname. And just the day before, we have one of the only like really beautiful visions of marriage and of passion when Abundio and his wife, just the very day before she dies, they have sex. And it's this kind of, she's, I think, frisky as a filly, which I should look that up. But if I start looking things up in the original, we literally will be here forever. But we have this kind of beautiful and uncomplicated vision of people who are happy together and passionate and in love. And then the very next day she dies. He does not have enough money to bury her. He goes to Pedro Páramo, who refuses him the money, and Abundio kills him. So it's very important. I mean, I've just laid out this whole thing, but it's important that we begin with Pedro Páramo and we end with Pedro Páramo. And our Juan Preciado, who in the beginning is our narrator, he kind of falls to the wayside. And we have all of these different voices who are telling us this story, which ultimately is a story about patricide. It's about killing your father. It's also about greed and lust and poverty and wealth and corruption. And when you lay it out like that, it's fairly simple. And it's also very, I mean, there are obviously a lot of subplots that are happening here, but it's very moving. It is, in many ways, a love story, but it is one that is couched in this idea of incredible corruption and violence and negativity. So I mentioned a couple of times so far this idea that this book is very kind of archetypal. This is a book that is speaking to really large questions. I mean, these are the things that you know, like classic tragedy, meaning like classical, meaning the classics, meaning Greek and Roman. It feels like that. And in many ways, I think that kind of timeless feel, the kind of mythic nature of the whole thing is what makes it so enduring. In many ways, it could be any town in Mexico. It could also be any town where we have this kind of disparity between the very rich and the very poor. So I wanted to kind of just like zip through a few of these like big archetypal elements that we have that add to that feeling. So we have this idea of the quest of a son trying to find his father. You think of Telemachus, this idea of needing to find your father. We also have just the quest story. This is someone who we have Juan Preciado very clearly heading out on this kind of quest. It is also a revenge story. So what he is hoping for is to take back what they are owed. So it's not revenge in the sense of violent revenge, but it's the sense of kind of avenging his mother, getting back what it is that Pedro Páramo stole from them. It's a story of the underworld. So I was kind of convinced that Comala was meant to be hell. It has everything to do with heat. There's all kinds of heat. A comal is like it's like a frying pan. And so the idea of comala is really speaking to the idea of heat, of things being heated up and cooked. So I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to read this as the underworld, as hell. But there's some very specific times where he is talking about hell and it is not synonymous with comala. So there's one part where he's talking about how all of the things that are left in the house of Doña Edwiges, all of the stuff that she has, a lot of people leave their stuff with her as they move on. And there's a mention of some people coming back to Comala from hell in order to get their blankets. So if they're mentioning, they're coming back from hell, then clearly Comala is not hell, but it is a kind of purgatory. So this also goes back to this idea, this kind of the Mexican idea of of dead people being kind of undead and being able to sort of revisit our world. And I suspect that as an American and someone who grew up in a very like Judeo-Christian kind of moment, that I am missing some of the nuance of this, but we're in very much like a purgatory sort of situation. It is very obviously a story about power, and by dint of power, we have a lot of corruption. So, and more specifically, this is the power of greed, the power of land holding over the people, the power of people who have things over the power of people who have nothing. So we have this idea of like, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We have this idea that this kind of greed can only lead to someone's downfall. We also, though, have this story about love. I mean, from the very beginning, we see Pedro Pàramo and this very kind of innocent and pure love that he has for Susana, and that love it never works. In fact, love on every single level throughout this book is either thwarted or kind of perverted. We have one couple who lives in the town who are brother and sister, but who are having sex. So we have this idea of incest, which is clearly very taboo. So even when we see like something that looks like a marriage, it is in fact perverted. And like the very first night when Dolores is supposed to go with Pedro Páramo, it is their wedding night. They're supposed to go off and consummate their marriage. And it turns out she's having her period. One of the interviews I listened to made the point that was actually a very daring thing to talk about in Mexico in 1955, the fact that she was having her period and that it would be unlucky for her to consummate her marriage. So she sends Eduviges instead. So even when we have these ideas of marriage, what we see here is actually Eduviges. Eduviges also does not consummate the marriage with Pedro Páramo because he's had too much to drink and he cannot consummate anything. But the point is that even when we have images of marriage and love and partnership, they end up being kind of perverted in some ways. I mean that in the broadest term of perverted. And ultimately, of course, again, we have this idea of patricide. I love the idea that we begin with Abundio. He's in the beginning of the book, and then he is also at the end of the book. And he is the one, our kind of lowly mule driver, who really rises up in many ways as the one person in the town who can sort of stand up against him. He's kind of every man, and he is the one who avenges. It's one of the sons. It's just kind of one of many of these poverty-stricken sons who comes and kills Pedro Páramo. It's also very important, and I think people sleep on this a little bit. It's important to recognize that when we have this first-person narrator, when Juan Preciado is coming into the town, and we very much identify with him because we're hearing his thoughts and we're kind of like right with him and we're figuring things out at the same time he's figuring them out. Lots of people just think that he is the narrator the whole entire time, which is not the case. He is one of many narrators. He's the first-person narrator. There are lots of third-person narrators, but this idea of the reader as being fairly like closely aligned with Juan Preciado is really important because we are aligning ourselves with one of the many sons of Pedro Páramo, and the fact that we have a name, which we're about to get to the names, which is amazing. But we have a name and we have an individual, and we are sympathetic to this individual who is confused and who's being like led through this weird house with all of this stuff in it by Eduviges, and he's left in this empty room, which is full of whispers and murmurs and whatnot of the undead, partially because people were tortured in that room, which is a whole other strain of the novel. But our association with Juan Preciado is so important. And I think one of the ways that we can think about this naming of Juan Preciado and Juan Rulfo is the idea that Juan Rulfo is he's the author of the book, but he is creating all of these different narrators, but he's giving himself kind of like an extension into the book in the form of Juan Preciado. So as a narrator, like Juan Rulfo in many ways is the third person narrator who's telling us the whole entire story, but we also have Juan Preciado, who is another first person narrator. So it's almost as if Juan Preciado is kind of like a stand-in in some ways for Rulfo. Okay, we're going to dive on in to the name part. So if you are someone who is listening to the Foxed page because you want to like become a better reader, which I'm doing my quotation. Oh my gosh. If you're on the YouTube, every time I do quotation marks on the YouTube, all these balloons come up. I think it's because it like looks like the peace sign or something. Always totally startling to me. But if you want to become a better reader, one of the things that you can do is simply pay more attention. And one of the things you should pay attention to are the names. So I was struck in this reading of Pedro Pàramo, I've read it many times, by the number of names. So many names are accumulating, which makes sense because we're hearing all of these different voices. And of course, each one of those voices comes with a name. So we have this sense of this proliferation of names, but every single one of them is also so significant. And in a book that's kind of spare, everything seems kind of barren. We have some description, although a lot of it is of the old Comala, when it was raining and fertile and had beautiful fields, as Dolores remembers it. Everything has been kind of stripped down. So we don't have a lot of landmarks and we don't have a lot of description. There's some, but not tons. So names are one of the ways that we can really like situate ourselves in time and in space. So they're really important. And Juan Rulfo is such a genius that, of course, he's not giving them names willy-nilly. This is like a very specific exercise in significance of names. So, of course, we have Pedro Pàramo. Pedro means rock, like piedra, or stone. It comes from the Greek, meaning stone. Peter, of course, is the apostle that apparently, I did not know this. I got this out of like literally like babynames.com. No, it wasn't that, but something like that. That Peter was the apostle that Jesus said, like, you are the apostle Peter, you are the rock upon which I will build the church. So you have this idea of Peter as also being an apostle. And Páramo is it's like a barren, it's kind of like a mesa, from what I understand. Somebody translated it as wasteland, and I think that's a bit extreme, but it is a land that's kind of open and somewhat barren, but also is a little bit high, which I think is interesting. Then we have Juan, of course. In many ways, the idea of Juan just, being John is kind of a stand-in for kind of every man because it is such a common name. But we also, of course, have John the Baptist. Is that even right? John the Baptist? I think that's right. Preciado is important because, of course, it means like valued or esteemed. And it is not precioso, like it's not precious. It's not something that just inherently is valued or is precious. It's preciado is more like it's being valued by someone else. So we have this idea of him as being valued. We have Dolores, which of course means like sorrows or pains. It's important that Juan's mother is called Dolores. We have Juan, we have Dolores, we have Pedro. We have Miguel, who is the son of Pedro Pàramo. Miguel apparently means who is God, ? And this is from Wikipedia. But it is an interesting question that Miguel would be someone who is questioning God because he is not a great dude and is certainly putting a lot of things to the test. Lucas comes from Luke, which comes from lucere in Latin, which means to shine, which is interesting only because the grandfather figure of them all is not someone who's actually shining. It also, I did not know this, but Lucas can be like a word like wacky, or it can be like someone's crazy. The etymology there, I guess, is because it's kind of close to loco. And what's interesting is Pato Lucas is like Daffy Duck, like this idea of like kind of a silly Daffy person. And I looked because I was like, I wonder if Daffy Duck even existed around the time of Juan Rulfo writing Pedro Pàramo. And sure enough, Daffy Duck and Pato Lucas were invented in 1937. So it is possible, in fact, that Juan Rulfo is using Lucas in the sense of kind of like Daffy, silly, like not very intelligent, which is interesting, the root of the entire family tree. We then have Eduviges, which is a German word. And it's very interesting to think about in Mexico in the middle of the 20th century, you had this very strange situation where you have this upper crust of people, this like very like a lot of the wealth being held in the hands of very few, and those people really wanting to live in very European ways. So if we give Eduviges this kind of German name, it speaks maybe a little bit to that. It also, Eduviges means one who is willing to fight, or a battle fighter. And Eduviges, as one of the last people standing here, really is someone who we think of as a fighter. We then have Fulgor Sedano. He's kind of like Pedro Pàramo's right-hand man. Fulgor, meaning like something that is refulgent, like that has a lot of splendor and brightness, which is somewhat ironic because he's really like the henchman of this greedy, like terrible person. I thought it was so interesting. Renteria is a Basque word. It's a Basque name, and it means to rent or a renter, which if it's Padre Renteria, it's very interesting to say that the priest has things kind of like on lease. that he's not really like owning his religion. And we could talk for, although I'm not really qualified to talk a lot about this, but the idea of the Catholicism and the failures of the church are hugely important in the book. Then we have Susanna. So Susanna is from the Hebrew, so you're pushing here a little against the Catholicism, and it's a version of Shoshana, and it means lily or rose. So this is kind of it's the name of something beautiful and something that can perish, something that is somewhat fragile. And it is a name that works well in Spanish. It's not quite as odd as Eduviges, but to me, it didn't sound like kind of your typical. It wasn't like Maria. So it had a little bit of like a frisson of some kind of like strangeness to it that seems absolutely perfect. Of course, her last name is San Juan. So here we have the idea of St. John the Baptist, and we have that association with both Juan Preciado and also with Juan Rulfo. We then have Dorotea, who is the woman who she's mentally ill, and she has the little bundle that she thinks is her baby. And her Dorotea means gift of God, which is so sad because she has this baby who might, have been her gift from God, but she was never able to have a baby. And she is the one at the end who is in the coffin with Juan Preciado. We have Donis, who is the brother of the incestuous couple. That comes from Dionysus, from the Greek, who is the goddess of wine and debauchery, which makes some sense because, in fact, he is, in an incestuous relationship. And it certainly sounds like his sister is not really like happy about it. So you have the idea of him as being cruel. But it's interesting to me that this is a name, it's an unusual name in Spanish, certainly. And it harkens all the way back, in fact, to the Greek, which is important because that's kind of this like timeless error that the whole text has. We then have abundio, which is abundant or plentiful, which is ironic because at the end, what makes him so angry at the end of the book, I'm not going to spoil, I'm not going to repeat what he does, but he doesn't have the money for what he needs to do, and that leads to a terrible chain of events. Also, significantly, his last name is Martinez, which is the son of Martin. Martin, of course, being associated with Mars and the god of war. So this is someone who has violence in him. It's like part of his name. It's also interesting to me that he would have the name Martinez. Presumably that is his mother's last name. We do not have a lot of like Abundio Páramo running around because, in fact, only Miguel is the one, as far as I know, who is acknowledged by Pedro. But as I mentioned before, there's so many names. We have Guzman, Damiana, Sixtina, Ana, Bartolo, like tons and tons of names, which again speaks to this proliferation. And I'm sure we could, look into the etymologies of all of these and we would be very impressed, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to end with this last name, which is Melquiades. So those of you who know Garcia Marquez well, if you were reading through Pedro Pàramo, you would be like, oh my gosh, it's Melquiades. Melquiades ends up being a crucial, crucial character in 100 Years of Solitude. And when Garcia Marquez names him that, it's like a nice little kind of nod to Pedro Pàramo. It's like he's acknowledging his debt to Juan Rulfo. And what I like about it is Melquiades, it's Greek origins, and it means God is my light. It comes from, this is so funny, it comes from the Greek Melquiades. So if you were reading 100 Years of Solitude and you're like, what's up with this weird Melquiades name? Maybe it's Melquiades. It in fact comes from the Greek via Pedro Pàramo, who was in fact evoking in many ways these epic storylines. But one thing I like about it is Melquiades is one of the very few people who survive in Comala, and have kind of, I think he has left, but he has survived. He is still living, at least at a certain point in the novel. So it's nice that Garcia Marquez chose someone whose name is very distinct, so we recognize it, but also someone who kind of survives Comala and then goes on to have this next life in 100 Years of Solitude, which is a good time actually to talk about some of the debts that Gabriel Garcia Marquez acknowledges, but also how we can think about magic realism and Pedro Pàramo. And then after that, we're going to look at the close of the novel. So the first thing that I will say about 100 Years of Solitude, it is magic realism. It's kind of your archetypal example of magic realism. And because it has so much of a debt to Pedro Pàramo, people are tempted to lump Pedro Pàramo in with the magic realism. And the rationale that they give is that a lot of what happens is one of the hallmarks of magic realism, and that is this, that in the world of magic realism, you have all of these unnatural things that are happening, supernatural things. example I give is in 100 Years of Solitude, when they drag the magnet through town and all of the hinges and all of the nails are coming out of the houses and are, zipping onto the magnet. Like, that is not something that's going to happen. So it's a supernatural event. But when it happens, the people in the town are not particularly wowed by it. They're definitely wowed by the idea of progress. This is a book. 100 Years of Solitude is definitely problematizing the question of progress, whether or not it is always good. But when these different things happen in the novel that are supernatural, people are not that surprised. The surprising thing is not that all the nails are flying out of their houses. So in Pedro Páramo, we also have a lot of things happening that are unusual, and people are not particularly noticing them or not remarking upon them. They don't seem that unusual to people. But what I would argue is that most of what is happening in Pedro Páramo that is unusual is people sort of being in these different planes. So you have dead people who are speaking with live people, and that is not remarked upon as unusual. But what I would say is that has to do with this idea that dead people are still sort of with us and they can still communicate to us. It is not like the stuff that we have in 100 Years of Solitude, like when one of Ursula's sons is killed, the little rivulet of blood like goes from that son all the way through town. It's jumping over curbs and it's, crossing the street, and it arrives to Ursula, and she's like, oh my gosh, one of my sons has died. She's not like struck by the fact that this rivulet of blood has made its way all across town. She just is struck by the death of her child. So we don't have little rivulets of blood that are, crossing the street and jumping over little curbs in Pedro Páramo. What we have instead are things that almost always have to do with death and dying. So at the beginning, I argued that Pedro Páramo is a modernist text because it's fragmented and time is elastic in it, and we have a lot of different voices, and we enter into the psychology of a lot of different people. All of those things make it feel very modernist to me. But what happens with 100 Years of Solitude is that this is a realist novel. That's why it's called magic realism. So the realist novel is just like your average novel. I think that's the best way to think about it. It really begins with Madame Bovary in 1851, maybe a little before that, depending on how you're going to categorize it. But the realist novel has an omniscient third person narrator, and it's pretty linear, and it's seeking to show us this whole world. So there are lots of details, and the reader is very anchored in that world and very well situated. There's a lot of verisimilitude, which means that the world of the novel feels very much like the world of a person. That is not the case with Pedro Páramo. In fact, the world is very shadowy and hard to even begin to picture. But when you have 100 Years of Solitude, yes, strange things are happening, but you're very anchored in that world. When Ursula is in her home and the rivulet of blood is making its way across town, the town is very identifiable. You can really feel, in fact, how it's laid out and how they built it and what the houses look like, and what Ursula is up to, and what the inside of her house looks like and her clothing. And so we have this very realist novel, one that feels very comfortable for us, feels very real. It feels very visual. We can really understand what's happening. I mean, there's a lot of confusing stuff happening with the generations and with the war, which, very much like the Mexican Revolution, it's very hard to figure out what is happening with the war, but that's very purposeful. So my ultimate argument is that the reason why 100 Years of Solitude is so much more accessible than Pedro Páramo is because it's magic realism, but it is also realism. It is a book that has difficult aspects and surprising aspects and new aspects, but for the most part, it reads like kind of like a normal novel. Pedro Páramo, on the other hand, is like, it's not Ulysses exactly, but it is very much like reading, it's not even like To the Lighthouse, it's more like reading like The Waves by Virginia Woolf. So when people are like, I don't know why Pedro Páramo is not read as widely as 100 Years of Solitude, I think that's kind of a silly question, because Pedro Páramo is a much more difficult text to access, whereas 100 Years of Solitude is tricky in some ways, but in fact, it's very easy to inhabit. So we're going to close today by looking at some of this amazing prose. We're going to look at the very end of the book. If you have not finished the book, maybe you want to sign off at this point. And if that is the case, thank you very much for tuning in. But for the rest of you, I'm going to go ahead and read just a few paragraphs. We're going to discuss them very lightly, but mostly I just want to treat you to this amazing prose in what I think is a very solid translation. So on page 116 of the Douglas translation, we have this. The media luna stood alone, in silence, everyone walking around barefoot and speaking in hushed voices. They buried Susana San Juan, and few in Comala noticed. They were celebrating. There were cockfights and music and shouting from drunkards and people playing games of chance. The lights from town reached all the way out here and appeared as a halo above the gray sky. Those were gray days, sad ones for the media luna. Don Pedro didn't say a word. He didn't leave his room. He vowed to take revenge on Comala. I'll cross my arms and Comala will die of hunger. And that's what he did. Couple of quick things here. The idea of the media luna, I mean, part of that, like the moon is very much associated with women, which is making it kind of ironic here. But the idea of a half moon, I mean, there's probably a lot I'm missing there, but it's this idea too of things being half. Like he's not ever fully in control, Pedro Pàramo. He's grasping all the time, but never has things, he's never satisfied. We also, very importantly here, have the media luna stood alone. So at the end, Pedro Páramo is very much alone in the midst of a town that is absolutely full of spirits and voices and presences. Very importantly here, we have the media luna stood alone in silence. So there is so much in this book about silence and noise. There are lots of different sounds. The evocation here of silence is really important, also because it comes right after a time where lots of sounds, celebratory sounds, are read. So then we have this idea of they buried Susana San Juan. So there we have this distance. The reader has a distance from the media luna. But then we have this interesting thing. The lights from town reached all the way out here. So that here is very much like the here at the beginning, where it is anchoring the reader. We are both in town because the lights are reaching from there, but it's to here. So we have this separation. So you get a sense that you're far from the media luna, but then you're also anchored there. So in some ways, the reader gets to be everywhere at once. Then we have this idea that in silence, Don Pedro he says right here, Don Pedro didn't say a word. And then essentially to himself, he says, I'll cross my arms and Comala will die of hunger. And that is what he did. So we have this very forceful thing, and yet there is very little voice given to it. So then we're going to move to the very end of the book, page 122. Behind them, still sitting in his equipal, Pedro Páramo watched as the procession made its way toward town. As he tried to get up, he felt his left hand fall lifeless to his knees, but he thought nothing of it. He was accustomed to seeing a new part of his body die with each passing day. He watched as the paradise tree trembled, shaking off its leaves. They all choose the same path, they all leave. Then he returned to the place where he had left his thoughts. Susana, he said, he closed his eyes. I asked you to come back. And then we have this very interesting, we have some of the guillemets with the little French, double arrows that designate speaking. And we have this beautiful thing, an immense moon hung over the world. I stared at you until my vision seemed to fade. What we have there is this really beautiful slippage into just the words of Pedro Páramo. So when we have the M dash and he says, Susana, I asked you to come back, it feels like he's being quoted like formally to some narrator, but then we slip into his actual thoughts. And it's so beautiful there because we have an immense moon hung over the world. There we have the full moon. The media luna is never full. He doesn't ever get what he wants, but here we have a sense of what that is. And then on the top of 123, he tried to raise his hand to reinforce the image in his mind, but his hand, heavy as if made of stone, would not lift off his legs. He tried to raise his other hand, but it dropped slowly down to his side until it rested on the ground, like a crutch providing support for a shoulder that had gone limp. This is my death, he said. The sun began to cascade over all the things covering the earth, giving them back their shape. The land spread out before him, empty and in ruins. The heat warmed his body. His eyes barely moved, but they jumped from one memory to another, obscuring the present. Suddenly, his heart stopped, and it seemed as if time as well had come to an end, and the breath of life with it. Couple of things very quickly. This is dawn. It's so interesting to me the way that time works, and part of it is that often it is at dawn that things are ending. So you have this sense of things as being illogical, but also as even like the dawning of a new day is not positive. We also have, again, this kind of mythical feeling here. The sun began to cascade over all the things covering the earth. We're pulling way back and we're looking at this story as if it is a universal story that can relate to anyone, anywhere on earth. So we have his breath of life stopping. As long as this is not just another night, he thought. He dreaded the nights that filled the dark with ghosts, that locked him in with his phantoms. That's what he feared. I'm sure Abundio will be back within a few hours with his blood-soaked hands to ask again for the help I refused him, and my hands won't be able to shield my eyes to keep from seeing him. I'll be forced to listen to him until his voice fades with the light of day, until his voice dies out. He felt hands on his shoulders and he straightened up, becoming stiff. It's me, Don Pedro, said Damiana. Would you like me to bring out your breakfast? Pedro Pàramo replied, I'm coming now. He supported himself on Damiana Cisneros' arms and tried to walk. After a few steps, he fell, pleading on the inside, but without saying a word. He hit the ground with a hollow thud, crumbling as if he were a pile of rocks. It's so beautiful. So here we have, it's very interesting. And I actually want to read very briefly that last line in Spanish as well. Dio un golpe seco contra la tierra y se fue desmoronando como si fuera un montón de piedras. So here we have piedras, which together with Pedro, we're beginning with this idea of Pedro, with this stone, and then we have this idea of rocks that essentially he is falling apart. So we have the disintegration of this cacique and of this kind of patriarch, but we also have him kind of falling into many different parts. You could imagine that each one of those piedras is a part of Pedro. He essentially is proliferating. We also have the sense that in the end, because he is turning into stone, that he's kind of fulfilling this prophecy. He's fulfilling what he is meant to be, which is in fact his name, which is stone. Mostly though, you have the idea here that you have this man, this landholder who has been in charge of everything, and that really truly everything is coming to an end. It is so haunting and so beautiful. So I really hope that this discussion of Pedro Pàramo, I think it went pretty well. I'm feeling pretty good about the idea of that as being at least one more voice that is speaking to the genius of Juan Rulfo. And I'm hoping that you got something out of it that was new and a little different and that helped you understand this masterpiece a little more fully. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.